Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us today. We are going to begin our webinar. So welcome to today's webinar on suicide prevention during COVID-19 and beyond. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. My name is Kathy Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of the center and will be facilitating this webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance for your feedback.
Your interaction with us is very important, so Q&A will occur at the end of the webinar, and you can put any questions you'd like into the Q&A or the chat room, and I will address them as we go. The presentation here was prepared for the MHTC network under the cooperative agreement from the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from sources identified, is in the public domain and can be reimbursed, reproduced. Presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor M. McCats-Cant served as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. I'm your presenter. My name is PJ Wanger. I have 28 years of experience in the field, and I am your presenter today. I started my career in physical medicine and rehab, and then switched over to counseling early on, realizing that people were more than just body parts. I spent 8 years in the psychiatric crisis unit. I've also worked in the inpatient unit, as well as outpatient, residential, and I also have a private practice. So in addition, I'm a national, state, and county trauma responder. So I respond to a lot of schools who have experienced a death by suicide, as well as unexpected deaths and traumatic events. So let's get started. Enough about me. Here's our objective. So today we're going to really talk about suicide and try to dispel some of the myths. We're going to talk about signs and symptoms so that we're able to recognize them both as clinicians and teachers and counselors. Not exactly sure who I have on the call, but certainly if you want to put in the chat room who you are, I'll take a look at that. We're going to identify risk factors so that we can begin to really hone in on which students we need to be looking at, what people we need to be looking at. We're going to talk about how COVID has increased the amount of mental health issues that we are seeing in the state. We also are going to understand how to have a meaningful conversation about suicide and develop awareness of how to intervene. And then I'm going to provide you with some resources and referral sources at the end. So I like Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote here: when it is darkest, we can see the stars. People who are often depressed and thinking about suicide feel that it is their darkest time. And we, as people who are going to intervene, really need to help them to see the stars. So some grim statistics. From 1999 to 2018, the suicide rate increased by 35%. That's a huge increase in less than, in a decade. And we have lots of suicide prevention resources out there. My concern is that we're not reaching enough people. So anytime that I can do a presentation or an educational webinar about suicide, I am in favor of that, because I feel like we need to reach as many people as possible. We can see from the statistics, and I don't need to read them to you, that males have a higher rate of suicide than females during that entire time. And for males, the rate increased 28%. So again, males have a higher rate, they're increasing. For females, the rate also increased 55%. And what we're seeing is, I've been doing this work for so many years, that initially what we saw in the field was that men and boys attempt or killed themselves by suicide in much more drastic measures, such as shooting or hanging, and females usually had a death by suicide by an overdose of pills or things like that. And what we're seeing is those differences are now getting closer. So we are seeing females who are killing themselves by suicide by hanging and by shooting. So again, not a really good statistic to think about. Some more statistics, just so you see, suicide is the 10th leading cause overall in the United States. It is second, though, among our young people 10 to age 34. And we're gonna talk about how COVID has really affected some of the young people that we are seeing. It is the 4th leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 35 and 54, so that middle age area. And there were more than 2.5 times as many suicides in the United States as there were homicides. So again, we seem to have a lot of news media around when there's a homicide, but suicide is actually at a much higher rate. So we're going to talk about the numbers, and I really would like you to help me out in the chat room to see what you're thinking. So we're talking about statistics from 2018, so 2 years ago, and we're going to go through the age group. So if we think about the ages of 10 to 14, in the year 2018, how many suicides do we think we had? Give me a number. And Kadi, if you can help me out with what numbers are coming up, that would be real helpful.
Yes, everyone, please feel free to enter your estimates in the chat box at this moment. And again, I apologize, my internet was unstable and I got booted off. Sorry about that, PJ.
No, you're fine. We're all okay. It's the age of the Zoom. So if we're just thinking about how many youth between the ages of 10 to 14 killed themselves in a 1-year period, what do we think that number would look like?
Someone said 500. 1,200, 525, 300, and 1,500.
Okay, so the number is actually 596 deaths by suicide in that age group during the year 2018. So whoever was in that area, 1,200, I sincerely hope we don't ever have that many deaths, but I can certainly see where somebody might come up with a high number. These are just deaths by suicide. These are not attempts. So that's a very different statistic. So in age groups 15 to 24, how many deaths do we think that we had in that age group in 2018? So a number. We have any numbers, Kadi? Any guesses? Okay, so let's see. So that number is 6,211. So we can see how that number jumps, for that age group. So again, 10 to 14, which people think is a little young, 596, you know, the number jumped astronomical. 6,211 deaths in 2018 in that age group. And I know we're having some internet problems with freezing and things like that, but we're gonna go on. Ages 25 to 34, how many deaths by suicide do we think we had in that age group? And again, I think Heidi got thrown out again, so I'm gonna look at what our numbers are doing. Okay, people are 15,000, 3,600, 8,000. Okay, those are all good numbers. 8,020. So we're seeing the numbers go up with the age groups. It's a little alarming. Ages 34 to 44. What do we think that number is? And of course, I'm already kind of giving you a hint because we're on an upward trend, but that's not necessarily the case. What numbers do we think in that age group? Okay, I've got 10,000, I've got 10,000, 1,000, 12,000, 9,000 and some. That number is 7,521. So actually, you know, in that age group, it goes down a little bit, although we have seen from the statistic that there's been an increase in that age group. And then our last age group, ages 45 to 54. What do we think in those numbers are? Anybody have a guesstimate of how many deaths by suicide in that age group? 10,000, 2,000, I see 9,800. Okay, that one is 8,345. So again, if we look at all of these numbers and we combine them all, that's a pretty high number for suicide, which is why, you know, I spend a lot of my time doing these seminars so that I can really get this message out, because it's really important that we begin talking about these things. So suicide and COVID. So here's just some statistics. And again, these statistics are brand new. They were from an online survey, so it certainly is not surveying all of the people. But what they found is that 5% of US college and high school students have reported making a suicide attempt during this pandemic. So again, we're not necessarily hearing about it all the time. If I have teachers in the room, you know, when kids are in school in person, you're seeing them every day. So you get to see a change in behavior. We're not necessarily getting to see that right now. 50% reported that they were worried about their mental health. Since the outbreak, 53% of college and 62% of high school reported experiencing stress. And a lot of the problem is we're not really in touch with some of our students in this age group, even in college. Colleges are doing remote classes. They're not, you know, they're not in touch with those kids in person. And we're seeing a lot of rise in anxiety. So anxiety and depression are on the rise. I was just on a phone call with several clinicians this morning, and they were reporting how busy they are, that just lots of work that they're doing right now. So we're gonna look at some myths and facts, you know, and again, feel free to share in the chat room. So in order for us to really talk about suicide and really understand it and prevent it, we really need to get past some of these misbeliefs that we have out there. And one of the biggest ones that I always encounter is it dangerous to ask a depressed person about suicide? So when we think about that, do we think that's a myth or a fact? You know, just think about, is that true or false? You know, the reality is it is false. When we talk to a depressed person who is thinking about suicide, it is actually a relief to them, and they actually will welcome the opportunity to talk. If we are comfortable with talking, that's one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to. If we are comfortable, they will talk about it. If we are uncomfortable, then young people who are thinking about suicide do not talk about it. People who want to die always find a way. We think that's true or false? Yeah. I got to reel it up. So I have a couple falses. I have a couple trues. Okay. The answer is false. People who want to die sometimes are really trying to get help. And if we offer help, they will not kill themselves. We know that the Surgeon General has announced that suicide is one of the most preventable causes of death. So again, just because a person is thinking about suicide and just because they're planning that out, we still have the ability to intervene. People kill themselves out of the blue. Do we think that's true or false? Okay, I have a lot of falses. I have a good group here because that is false. People usually do not just kill themselves out of the blue. There's usually some warning signs a week or even 2 weeks prior to their suicide that sometimes people miss. And again, we're not missing it because we don't care. We're missing it because we don't know the signs and symptoms. So hopefully by the end of today, you will know all that. Someone who has their act together isn't at risk for suicide. True or false? Yep, we got a bunch of falses. Yep, very good. It is false. Sometimes people who try to kill themselves certainly look like they have their act together. I have been on responses where someone who was a professional, went to work every day, worked in a bank, always pleasant, always cheerful, and then did kill themselves. And people did not realize it. And when we really were there on the scene during the response, people began to remember things that were signs and symptoms that they remembered after the fact, but they missed them leading up to it. So again, just because somebody looks like they have their act together isn't always, necessarily true. Most suicides happen around the winter holiday season. True or false? Oh, we got some trues, we got some falses. Trues, we're kind of mixed on that one. The answer to that is false. Most of the suicides happen in the springtime, and we're not really sure why that is. The research does indicate that most people who kill themselves by suicide happens in the spring. Certainly around the holiday season, people do experience more depression, especially if they are alone or if they experience like a seasonal affective response to the shorter days. But most suicides do happen in the springtime. When someone recovers after hitting rock bottom, their risk of suicide declines. Do we think that's true or false? False, 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 false. Okay, I have some great people on the line. You are correct, that is false. Sometimes when people hit rock bottom, they may still be thinking about suicide. And again, it's about having the conversation and really looking for those signs and symptoms. A little bit more. Giving someone a hotline number is enough. So if I give someone who's thinking about suicide a hotline number, that's enough to prevent them from taking their life. Would we say that's true or false? Okay, good group. Yes, that is false. We can't give, it's sort of like giving the aspirin for a heart attack and walking away. So if I give an aspirin, the person may or may not still have a heart attack, but I can't just leave them alone and walk away. I have to do something and call 911 or something. So it's the same thing with hotline numbers. And I'm going to give you hotline numbers, and I encourage you to always have them on you and to have them available so that you can give them to people. But we're going to talk about how we use hotline numbers. Once a person is suicidal, they will always be suicidal. Do we think that's true or false? Oh, I already gave you the answer. I'm sorry, false. So sometimes when a person is suicidal and they get treatment and they get help, they begin to function perfectly fine. And a good example of that is if you want to see a really good video, Kevin Hines is the gentleman who at 19 jumped off the San Francisco Bridge and survived. And he does a YouTube video, which is really powerful. And he will tell you that now that he's gotten a lot of treatment and he really is using his tools, that he does not think about suicide like he did during his very heavy time of having a lot of these emotions and these suicidal thoughts and things like that. Suicide only affects individuals with a mental health diagnosis. True or false? Okay, I'm seeing falses. Yep. Very good. False. Suicide can affect anyone just because they do not have a mental health diagnosis, or if they do have a mental health diagnosis, does not mean that they will take their life. We see people all the time who, again, people think it's out of the blue, kill themselves, and everybody is very shocked and goes to the place of, well, they look so normal and they went to work and they had a family and they always look so cheerful. And we are sort of stunned by that because they didn't have an issue with mental health that we are aware of. People who die by suicide are selfish and take the easy way out. True or false? Absolutely. I'm so glad you guys are on point with this. It is false. People who die by suicide are not selfish. They're not taking the easy way out. They're not even thinking that way. They are just really thinking about ending the pain that they are in. And so when I'm talking to loved ones who've lost a relative or a friend who's killed themselves by suicide, and they're saying to me, I can't believe they didn't consider their family, or they didn't consider how it was going to affect people. And I try to explain to them that that is not where their thought process is. They're not thinking about how their death is going to affect other people. They're thinking about wanting so much to be out of that pain. So just a few more. Talking about suicide will lead to and encourage someone to kill themselves. True or false? I think we are, yep, right on board. False. We need to begin to have these conversations. When I'm doing responses in schools, especially, and students say to me, nobody talks to us about suicide. And again, we have a suicide curriculum in schools, but students really want to have conversations, and they're telling me all the time that nobody talks about it. So we really need to begin to get comfortable. And it's not an easy topic to talk about. No one can stop a suicide. This one, I'm just going to give you the answer because I already told you. Surgeon General said it is the most preventable kind of death. Only experts can prevent suicide. True or false? Very good. False. Absolutely. Everyone is involved in preventing a suicide, down to the person who, drives the bus, to the person who might work in the coffee shop, to the pastor, to the counselor. Everybody is involved with this prevention effort. Once a person decides to kill themselves, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. True or false? Okay, we got some falses. You are correct. When we can intervene and talk to a person about suicide and refer them and get them help, we can prevent that suicide from happening. So we're really going to talk about signs and symptoms. And I want us to be really clear that these signs and symptoms do not fit every person. But when we know all the signs and symptoms, we can begin to look for them. And again, just because somebody's sad does not necessarily mean that they are going to kill themselves. But certainly a change in moods, where somebody has gone from being really happy to really sad, is something we want to pay attention to. I call them red flags. So if I have a friend and suddenly my friend is not, her normal self, or is very sad, or is all over the place, I'm going to ask what's going on. I want to know what's going on. And again, it can work the opposite way. So I've seen people who also, prior to their suicide, go from being very depressed for months to suddenly they're very happy. They're doing things again. They're engaged, and people think, oh, okay, they're over that worst period. Well, no, sometimes that false happiness that we see is about they've resigned themselves to the fact that they are going to kill themselves, and so that things are going to end, so they're feeling good about themselves. So again, we need to watch both of those sides. Feeling hopeless. We're having a lot of people right now during COVID who have been shut up in quarantines and, with their families and not going to school or seeing their friends, who are very hopeless right now. And that is something that we are addressing all the time. Sleep problems. Again, we don't necessarily see that in people, but certainly if, my friend is telling me that they're up all night, or they're telling me they're having problems sleeping, I need to pay attention to that. In schools, if students are falling asleep in class, a lot of times we go to the angry place or the punishing place, but we really need to be in the place of, hey, what's going on? Withdrawal and isolation. That's a really tough one right now because we are socially distanced. And so a lot of people are naturally isolated. We are seeing an increase in death by suicide right now. And again, it just depends on the person. You know, what is going on with them and who's talking to them and who's intervening. The most recent suicide that I responded to was a gentleman who had been in treatment years and years prior. And because of the COVID and the isolation, and he had been at home so long and was feeling so helpless, you know, he did kill himself by suicide. And it was really sad because people were like, well, he was out of treatment and he was so much better. And where did this come from? You know, and that social isolation is really hurting a lot of us. Changes in personality. You know, if we know somebody and suddenly they're changing, either they're irritable or they're angry all the time, or they're sad or they're withdrawn, we really need to pay attention to those signs and symptoms. And again, just because somebody has these signs does not necessarily equate to they are going to kill themselves. But we won't know that unless we have the conversation, and we're going to talk about that in depth, because I really want us to be comfortable with that by the time we're finished here. Dangerous or harmful behavior. So what we see sometimes is high risk behavior in young children and teenagers. We see cutting, maybe substance abuse in people who are older. We see an increase maybe in alcohol use or drinking and driving, things like that. A recent trauma or a life crisis. You know, if somebody is already experiencing a mental health issue, even if we're aware or not aware of it, and something traumatic happens in their life, it can push them over the edge. So we need to be paying attention to that. Changes in personality and appearance. Again, because sometimes we're not seeing everybody every day, we don't know that. And, you know, and some people are not comfortable being on Zoom and being, you know, on camera all the time. And so this is harder to detect now. And so sometimes, like, I'm encouraging my young people to FaceTime, and my clients that I see, I want them to be on Zoom. And even if they come on and just let me see them for a couple minutes, and then you want to, you know, put a picture up or whatever, I'm fine with that, but I do just need to see you. You know, making preparations. This sometimes we see in older adults, and it can look very pro-actionary, like people will be like, oh yeah, you know, I'm putting things in place so that, you know, if I die, that my family, you know, isn't saddled with all these bills, and they know exactly what I want, you know. And we may think that that's just a preparatory behavior, when in fact they may be actually making preparations. So we need to talk about those things. Changes in academics, positive or negative. Again, sometimes, you know, young people, right before they try to kill themselves, there is a change in academics, and sometimes that's for the better and sometimes it's for the worse. So both of those changes we need to talk about. Certainly when people are threatening or talking about suicide, either in person or on social media, or they're posting things that allude to suicide, or that, you know, maybe they talk about, you know, this star, you know, killed themselves by suicide and they're immortal now. You know, we need to be paying attention to some of those things. Negative view of self, that coincides with suicide, because the person thinks that they're so horrible that they need to end their life, and that the pain that they have is never going to go away. Irritability, I already talked about. Feeling like a burden. So this is one of the things we see with our older adults right now, especially in the COVID situation. We've had a lot of older adults who've had to come home and live with family members because they've been in situations where they had caretakers coming into their homes, and because of COVID, those caretakers are no longer coming in. So they've had to move home with family members, and they feel like a burden. So again, that number that you saw in that higher level group, and I apologize, I don't have statistics for ages higher than that, but our older generation is not without death by suicides. Again, talked about the cutting and the self-harm behavior and the risky behaviors and the substance abuse, you know, but also family interactions. We need to pay attention to that. That's certainly been a struggle during the COVID times as well. You know, possessions of weapons, you know, do we know if somebody has a weapon? When I worked in the crisis unit, we went out to homes of people who we got reports that were talking about suicide. And one of the first things we really need to find out is if they have a weapon in the house. You know, we know that the purchase of gun sales has gone up exponentially during the COVID times and during our political climate and other things that are happening in the world. So, you know, that is an access to means. And it's not only an access to means by the person who owns the weapon, but it's an access to means by all the people around them. Stockpiling pills, we would not necessarily know about if somebody's doing unless they are in our home and we're noticing things missing from medicine cabinets. So I tell people to certainly pay attention to that. Giveaways, you know, that was, you know, one of the things that people sometimes miss. I was on the scene of a student who, again, her grades were going up. She was accepted to college. She was doing really well. And right a couple days before she killed herself by suicide, she gave a pile of pictures away to her friends. And she did it under the sort of guise that, oh, I was going through stuff in my room and I found these pictures and I have duplicates, so I'm giving you some. And again, after she killed herself, the friends were very distraught that, you know, they felt they should have known this. And again, it's not about I should have known, it's about let's get the knowledge so we can move forward and know it now. Truancy, running away, those are things we see in young kids, but also adults do that as well. You know, we just tend to run away in a different manner. So sometimes we run away from things by not being present, or we run away by not being available, or, you know, we're always gone because we don't want to be home. So again, those kinds of things can apply to adults as well as children. When we're trying to be perfect all the time, that's another thing. You know, people who are perfectionists, that always looks really good, but sometimes it is really hard to maintain that perfectionism all the time. And so that can be a risk factor. And again, we talked about risk taking. So I really also want to identify virtual signs because we're doing so much remotely and we are doing a lot of social interaction remotely, and depending on where you are and how much your area is opening up. Here in New Jersey, we are opening up some places of business, and you know, we have some in-house dining opening up and things like that, but still a great deal of our interactions are still happening remotely. And so we really need to pay attention to what is being posted, and not only by our youth, but also by our adults. There are some adults who are really suffering, who are very anxious and feeling depressed and feeling isolated from people. And because of their fear of COVID, they won't go out. And they are beginning to get very depressed and posting things online that indicate that. We need to be paying attention to that. Hashtags, emojis, those kinds of things. And I tell parents all the time, you know, pay attention to what your, you know, children are posting. Pay attention to what your friends are posting. You know, are you following accounts? You know, I know that people are telling me that, you know, their Facebook and Instagrams and Snapchats have gotten larger and larger as the social distancing has gone on, because they're talking to more and more people online. But there's also more and more things going around, you know, and what are we posting? You know, we had a student just the other day that we hospitalized because they were posting pictures of famous people who had killed themselves, and not writing any captions that were indicative of somebody who was thinking about suicide, but it was the fact that they kept posting these pictures of famous people who had killed themselves that, you know, again, it was a sign that we investigated and found out that yes, this person was thinking about suicide. And again, we hospitalized that individual. So we really need to be paying attention to the virtual signs as well. So we have people indicate that they may be thinking about suicide in a number of ways. Some of them are direct verbal cues, which are pretty easy. You know, if somebody says, I wish I was dead, the idea that they're thinking about suicide is right on the table and we can talk about it. You know, these are the direct verbal cues, and I don't need to review each one of them with you, but it is really somebody saying, I am thinking about killing myself. And sometimes we might think that it's a joke. So sometimes people say, if I don't get this job, or if I don't pass this test, or if I find out that I'm sick, you know, I'm going to kill myself. And sometimes we think that's just a figure of speech and we let it go. And we really need to not let it go, because that's really serious. You know, I'm better off dead than alive. I sat in a family Zoom meeting with a relative who was 95 years old, who made the statement, I never thought at 95 I would be sitting in my house and unable to go out and do anything. And I didn't think this was the way I was going to end my life, and again, I'm with family, so everybody left that go is just something she said. But because of the work that I do, I had to get off the call with the group. And then later I called her up and I said, I was really concerned about what you said in the meeting. And, I'm really wondering if you're thinking about killing yourself, because, I love you and I wouldn't want that to happen. And again, we had a conversation, and she was safe. She just was feeling very frustrated. But again, I wouldn't have known that unless I had followed up. So some indirect verbal cues, and this is what we're seeing a lot more of these days. Certainly the first one, I cannot tell you how often I hear this from my clients and from people that I work with. I can't take this anymore. And we can ignore that by thinking it's just having to do with COVID, or the fact that they've been, not able to do their normal activities, or they maybe lost their job. But it's really asking more questions about that. The young people are saying they feel stuck. So I hear that a lot from my younger people. I feel stuck. I can't do anything. What does that mean? Where are you stuck? And again, I continue the conversations, but we'll learn how to do that a little bit later. And again, who would miss me if I was dead? That's a real easy one to go to right now, because we're so socially isolated from each other that we are missing that interaction. And we as human beings are programmed to be connected, to have social interaction. And as much as I will hear people say, well, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert, there is a place where we are programmed to have human connection. So even my students and my young people and my adults who were like, when this started, they were like, oh yeah, this works for me. I don't really have to see anybody. I'm really an introvert. I can stay home. I'm getting a lot done. As the time has gone on, that has really changed for them. And they are now telling me that they really need to see some people, or they really need to be out. So again, we can't let some of these things go by without really looking into them. Life isn't worth living. I want to end it. Some of these indirect verbal cues, nobody cares about me, or, I can't do this anymore. And I have that twice, and I apologize, but that's a really important one for me because I keep hearing it a lot. So what are risk factors? So people, again, risk factors do not mean that I'm going to kill myself. It just means that I have a higher risk to go there. Certainly someone who has made previous attempts, that is considered a risk factor. That does not necessarily equate to just because I had an attempt means I'm going to have another one. But certainly if I've had a suicide attempt and I've lost a parent, or I've lost a job, or something traumatic has happened, it is easy sometimes to go back to that place. So again, that's a risk factor. Do they have a plan? When I'm talking to people about suicide, what is your plan? Have you thought about how you would kill yourself? And that's an uncomfortable conversation. I understand that, but it's a conversation that is necessary. People who are having death wishes. And we need to distinguish that a little bit, because, I've had people say to me, oh, those people who skydive and those people who do, racing, like they just have a death wish. That's not exactly what a death wish is. A death wish is somebody who really just doesn't want to be alive and, does things that they think will kill themselves. So it's a very big difference. Someone with depression, certainly when we have depression, when it is severe and it's not treated, it is easy to go to the place of, I'd rather not be here. Substance abuse, we have instances where we have people who have overdosed as a suicide, as a way of killing themselves. And we've also people who've accidentally overdosed. But substance abuse is definitely a risk factor. If we have a history of family suicide, when I'm on responding to a suicide of an adult, and there are children in the house, or a spouse or other relatives, I am very concerned about those other people. Sometimes with children, a parent who kills themselves sort of gives them the okay to do that. And sometimes with the relatives or people close to that, they're so distraught that it's easy to go there as a solution. So we need to be certainly aware of that. Recent loss, sexual orientation. We are aware that the LGBTQ plus population has a higher rate of suicide. I'm going to give you a resource on the end. And again, that has to do with not being accepted, feeling like nobody, they don't belong, nobody, cares about them, being bullied, all of those things that go along with that. And that's just not in our school-age children. We see, I want to say, sexually charged behaviors that happen in the community aimed at adults. We've had gay people who have been beat to death because somebody did not like that they were gay. So again, sexual orientation could be a risk factor. When there's a disappointment, and again, there's a lot of disappointments right now, people's birthdays and people's anniversaries and, not being able to do the things that I normally do. People who aren't going on vacations because they have anxiety and they're afraid being in the community. So again, disappointments, and we have to be careful about what we think is a disappointment and what other people think is a disappointment. Because oftentimes I hear people make comments about, they should just be grateful that they have X, Y, Z and not worry so much about that thing that they didn't get. And it's not really about that. It's not a leverage of one to the other. It's about, is it a disappointment for them and how does it affect them? Being rejected, already talked about that with our LGBTQ plus population, but also rejection from, a loved one or a rejection from a partner or something like that. If there's financial problems, and again, we're seeing a lot of that. Historically, during the Depression, a lot of big financiers did kill themselves. So we did see that during the Depression. There's certainly a lot of financial issues happening right now based on the current climate. Humiliation, any kind of humiliation, and that could be, again, something that we don't view as being humiliated, but they certainly view as being humiliated. Certainly one of the examples I can think about is a minister of a congregation who was found to be actively involved in a sex addiction, and it was so humiliating for them that they did kill themselves. If there's been assault or bullying, I don't need to go into that, but that certainly is a risk factor. Relationship loss, and again, that is a big risk factor depending on what the relationship was. Certainly, a partner, certainly a loved one. If there's a terminal illness, people with terminal illness really sometimes think about suicide because their thought is, I'm going to die anyway and I'm suffering so much, and why don't I just take control and end it for myself? Expulsion, kids who get expelled from school, which right now isn't really a case, but certainly when we are beyond COVID, it will be a case again. If there's family problems, again, the job loss, which causes all kinds of things like rejection and humiliation and shame, and then financial difficulties, those kinds of things. And certainly if there's a death close to me, that is definitely a risk factor. So I just want to take a few minutes and have us listen to this video. And I think this young person puts this in really good terms for us. So we're just going to take a few minutes and listen to a little bit of this. So.
Suicide sucks. And it's really hard to talk about. Extremely hard. I think the reason that it's so hard for me specifically to talk about is because it's always going to be really real for me. On October 1st of 2015, I tried to kill myself. Since then, I still think about it every day, whether that be in the context of being ashamed of it, or maybe walking myself through it again to see how I could help someone who's walking through it right now. Or maybe even just wishing I would have died that night. It's always going to be a part of my story. While I was writing this talk, I actually almost lost a good friend to suicide. So yeah, Suicide is really real for me in a lot of aspects. And it's so hard to stand up here and to talk about it, because talking about it makes it even more real. And I wish with my whole heart that it didn't have to be so real. I wish that if I just didn't talk about it, it would go away. But as they say, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I have to stop thinking it will go away. I have to stop begging for lives to be saved only within the four walls of my mind. I have to stop believing that silence is the answer when 44,000 people are still dying by suicide each year. I have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. So I'll start. I remember watching my anxiety turn into hating myself, into thinking that I didn't deserve to live anymore. I remember what made me want to die. But the boldest memory I have from that night was the thought I had just before I tried to overdose. Why can't I just ask for help? I could hear my parents downstairs and my sister in the room next door. Part of me just kept begging myself to go tell one of them what I was feeling. But that part was too small. The bigger part kept saying, Sadie, this has to be a secret. It kept telling me that I was alone and that no one would understand. It kept saying that I couldn't ask for help because asking for help would make me a burden. And God forbid I'd be a burden. Looking back, I really do wish I would have chosen to ask for help, because I know now without a shadow of a doubt that my friends and family would have been there for me. But how was I supposed to know that those dark thoughts that I was having were thoughts I could have spoken out loud? If I had never heard anyone else say, hey, sometimes things get really dark and I want to end my life, how was I supposed to know that if I reached out for help and I said those things, no one would have called me crazy? Now, it's a scary thing to walk up to even your closest friend and say, these thoughts in my head, they won't slow down, and I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't focus, and I want to die. How can you be sure that they won't freak out and make it worse? Or even more so, how can you be sure that they wouldn't feel so burdened by your hurt that they would turn around and walk away? We don't know because nobody talks about it. In my experience with the multitude of kids I've encountered in not only a psychiatric facility, but also just within my school, suicidal people are terrified to ask for help because the whole idea of suicide has been stigmatized to the point where even those of us who struggle with it seem to believe we are, in fact, crazy. I truly believe that if suicidal people knew it was safe to ask for help, they would. So let's show them that it's safe. The first step is to get educated. These things, they matter. According to the CDC, suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. I believe that it needs to be common knowledge that suicide is not an issue of race, of gender, of class, of age, of sexual orientation. Suicide is a human issue. And once we grasp that idea, we are far more likely to take steps towards education because we then realize that no one is immune, not us or our families. The next step under the umbrella of education is to use the resources we have available to not only learn the signs of suicide, which is extremely important, but also to understand that we have the power to halt suicide in its tracks. The following statistic breaks my heart, and I hope that it breaks yours too. 81% of people who attempt suicide tell someone what they're going to do and when they're going to do it before they do it. 81% of the time, they tell someone what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. Do you understand what that means? That means that 81% of the time, we as loved ones, we know what they're feeling. We know what they're thinking. We even know what they're planning. Yet we stay silent. Why? I understand that some of us may fear that the troubled person might feel betrayed if we tell someone, or maybe we fear that getting involved means it wasn't just a joke and it wasn't just a threat. Getting involved means it's real. We don't want it to be real. But I hate to break it to you, but getting involved doesn't make it any more real than it already is. Our fears do not excuse our silence. They don't. So what can we do to make sure that when we're made aware of someone's suicidal ideation, we choose to get them help instead of walking away? Well, I think the next step to do that is to get honest. The scariest thing I ever did was own up to my past and tell my story. In our society, we are so obsessed with image, giving this false idea that we have it all together. But where has that gotten us? The walls that we've built around our hurt have fostered more than 44,000 suicides a year. Not to mention 25 suicide attempts for every death by suicide. Raw vulnerability is terrifying, but not as terrifying as the thought of losing our loved ones to suicide. When I say get honest, I'm not asking that you talk about suicide if you've never experienced it. I'm not asking that you walk up to every stranger and tell them the darkest parts of your life. I'm just saying, stop wearing a mask. Stop pretending that you're having a good day when you're not. Stop lying. Stop acting like you have it all together when you don't. Show people who are battling suicide that it's okay if they don't have it all together. Show them that, yeah, everybody has their crap they have to deal with. Be transparent in the way that you choose to live your life. I understand if you feel like that honesty is scary, because it is. I've been there, still there. But getting real about the tough stuff is the only way that we're going to be able to help people who feel like they're alone in this. I know it's tough, but step 3, get brave. I went to school with this girl for about 4 years, but up until our senior year, we had never spoken, different social circles. But for Suicide Prevention Week of 2016, I wrote an article about my suicide attempt, and I published it, and she read it online. A few days later, she walked up to me and told me that she read my article, and followed that up with, "I want to die." That was the first of many people who have chosen to confide in me about their struggles since I started talking about mine. It's a ripple effect. When someone feels safe and secure because of your honesty, they'll choose to be honest too. It's so hard every time someone tells me something like that. I question, what if I say the wrong thing and they end their life? Or what do I even say in this situation? More often than not, I question, why can't I make it better? I understand that fear. I get it. One time I was talking to this really awesome teacher that I had about what I was struggling with, and I randomly felt this overwhelming wave of shame, and I began apologizing to her for telling her these things, for burdening her. Her response was pretty awesome. People say you won't remember what people said, but you'll remember how they made you feel. So I'm pretty sure the following quote isn't exactly verbatim, but she meant something along the lines of, "I'd rather face these thoughts with you than lose you any day." And I think that that's pretty powerful. I think we all need to be like her. We all need to choose to tell that fear that it has no place here. We need to be brave and talk about something that is so very scary. So let's be like my teacher. Let's choose to save lives. Let's talk about it. When I say let's talk, I'm not asking you to walk up to the person sitting next to you and be like, "Hey, 44,000 people die by suicide each year." Or, "Hey, one time I tried to kill myself." That's not what I'm asking of you. I'm just asking that you don't run from it. Don't avoid it. When you see someone who is hurting, Walk up to them, please. Just walk up to them and talk about it. It is not that hard to be there for people. You walk up to them and you tell them that whatever they're feeling, they can share with you. Tell them that they can tell you those dark thoughts that they're having. Just face it. Be there for people. I know that sometimes helping others requires us to be honest and vulnerable about our own struggles, and that means we have to overcome a lot of shame sometimes. But like I've said, we cannot let shame and we cannot let fear stop us. So from this day forward, I ask that you would join me and no longer sit in silence while suicide takes our friends and our family. Let's get educated. Let's get honest. Let's get brave. But most of all, let's talk. Thank you.
No. Okay. So Sadie's very powerful. I hope everybody heard her message. Again, suicide is 100% preventable. So we need to speak up and reach out. And that's what we're going to learn next. So the conversation that she's talking about is really beginning to talk to people about what they're feeling and not be afraid to use the word suicide or to be afraid to ask somebody if they're going to kill themselves. So there are some rules and recommendations around this. The location. We don't want to do this in public. We want to do it in private where the person feels comfortable and safe. We want to be persistent. So if we know that somebody is acting differently and we know that there's something going on, we need to push a little bit. The ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? It is the question. And really listening. You heard her. She was apologizing for all her conversation, but the teacher said, I'd rather listen to you here than not have you here. Allowing them to express how they feel and not trying to fix it. Again, we're not all therapists, we're not all counselors. It's not your job to fix. As a counselor, I can't fix it all the time either, and I need to reach out for additional help. And then having the resources. So the conversation, which is the hardest part for people to start, is, really something like, what's going on with you? Something's up. Do you want to talk about what's going on? I've noticed you're down lately. The what's going on piece, and you can see it sort of is pervasive through the questions here, is the real piece that we're going to need to have to ask. And it's really about being a detective. So I tell people, the detective gets all the data and then passes on the information. That's basically what we're doing. We're being detectives to make sure that somebody is okay. Noticing them. I'm worried about you. That's a really powerful one. Like her teacher said, I'd rather be listening to this conversation with you than having you not be here. And don't let people just say, I'm okay. Anytime I hear somebody say I'm okay, I know they're not okay. So that's sort of my red flag that there's something else going on. If I've noticed something and I'm asking them about it and they say they're okay, I know that there's something going on. So just an FYI for those of you who get that a lot from people around you, and then again, just letting somebody know that you're here for them. Asking the question, are you thinking about killing yourself? That's a really hard thing to do. And when I'm teaching young clinicians and I'm mentoring them and supervising them, we have a whole portion of our supervision that is just about them being able to ask that question. And oftentimes I will have them stand in front of a mirror and ask that question over and over again to themselves in the mirror until they are comfortable with those words rolling out of their mouth. So again, I know if it's hard for people who are trained in the field to ask the question, that it's really hard for people who are not trained, but the question needs to be asked. You heard her, we need to talk about it. I can't find out if somebody's going to try to kill themselves unless I ask that question. So again, it's so important to ask the question, and again, you can couch it in some other stuff. Sometimes when people are so upset or so depressed, they think about suicide. Are you thinking about killing yourself? I can couch it in that other material, but the bottom line is I need to ask that question. Are you thinking about ending your life? You know, the last one, do you wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? And some people say, yeah, I just want to go to sleep. Okay, but do you wish you'd never wake up? So do you see how I don't let them kind of get out of the conversation? You know, recommendations, avoid sarcasm. A lot of times when we are talking to people about suicide, we use sarcasm and jokes and sort of other maybe inappropriate statements because we're uncomfortable with the topic. So I've heard people say, oh, you're not really thinking about killing yourself. That would be so stupid, or that would be so selfish. You know, again, I've already told the person that I'm uncomfortable about it. So now they're not going to talk to me about it. You know, again, you know, asking them how they feel, not telling them how you feel. So the worst thing that, you know, people can do is say, oh, well, you know, you're feeling like that now, but, you know, when you go home and get, you know, have a meal and get a good night's sleep, you'll feel better in the morning. That's not how it works. So we're not trying to tell them how they feel. And again, like Sadie said, if you've never made a suicide attempt, you can't talk to somebody about that, but you can talk to them about their feelings and what they're thinking. And again, I have to go into that judgment free. You know, suicide, like she said, is human. It's a human condition, and it affects people of all ages, sexes, races, colors. It is not specific. And I add this one, stay off your phone. So a lot of times when I hear people talking to other people about something really heavy, they're on their phone because they've just lost paid attention. And that's where you really have to pay attention and you really have to listen. You know, and again, a lot of times when people ask me, you know, how do you teach people to listen? My answer is by telling them to be quiet. So that's how I teach people to listen. If you can be quiet, you're listening. You know, avoid joking. You know, sometimes we do that because we're uncomfortable with the topic. And offering hope. You know, even if I say, you know, suicide is the most preventable cause of death, there is hope. There is help out there for you. And again, I'm going to refer back to Kevin Hines. If you look at his videos, he talks about if one person had asked the question the day he made his attempt, he would not have gone through with it. So again, if we're talking about it, we can prevent it. And then using our resources, really using our resources, and not just resources of giving somebody a hotline number, but sitting with somebody to call the hotline, or sitting with somebody when they're going to go to the emergency room, or sitting with somebody when you're delivering them to the counselor. You know, it's not just drop and go. We said that at the ER all the time in the emergency room. You know, it wasn't that you just dropped somebody off who was suicidal and you ran because you thought the hospital had, you know, the safety covered. It's about really being with that person. You know, rules of thumb, we don't leave the person alone. Once they've told us that that's what they're thinking about, we might suggest that they speak with somebody. And this is a critical piece because it's not always the person that we think that they need to talk to. So for children, we often think we need to talk to their parents, but that may not be who they can talk to. Maybe it's an aunt or an uncle or an older sibling. You know, so ask them who would be the person that you could talk to about this, that we could bring in to help us, you know, and offering to go with them. You know, again, the drop and go scenario never works. And then it only reinforces to that person that they're not worthy of something, that they don't really count, that you just can't be bothered. You know, again, determining a trusted adult. A lot of times in schools, we send people to the counselors, and that's not necessarily who the students trust. It might be their art teacher. It might be the cafeteria worker. It might be the custodian. You know, we have to find out who that person is. And same with adults. When we're talking to somebody, it may not be anybody in their family or their spouse that they're going to talk to about this. It may be a best friend or somebody else that we can reach out to. And so we help them reach out, but we don't leave them alone. We're really trying to get people to choose life, you know, and understanding that there are other people who feel like this, and there are treatments out there to help people. And it is okay to get treatment and get help. You know, and again, if you're a person who's had any kind of mental health condition or any kind of treatment, it's okay to talk about that. I, as a counselor, have been through my own counseling, and I talk about it all the time so that people know that I have been there. You know, it's not like I'm just saying, go to counseling, and I have not been there, or I don't believe in it. You know, so again, it's okay to share those things and follow up. There's nothing more important than a phone call the next day just to say, hey, how'd it go? Or what's the plan? Or how can I help? You know, and then the other thing is training. There are two programs out there nationwide. One is QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer. And there is also Mental Health First Aid, which is nationwide. And Lady Gaga is one of the primary supporters of that suicide prevention program. And it is nationwide. They train adults. They train youth, the youth mental health first aid. They train people to work with youth. There is also now a teen mental health first aid program. And that training is being offered to pastors and public people. And my favorite example is I had a client whose daughter lived in Scotland, and she worked for a retail company. And the retail company trained all their employees in mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is a nationwide program. And my client lost her child to suicide, one child. And so she was on the phone with her daughter in Scotland, and she was talking in sort of indirect death thoughts. And because her daughter had the training, she said to her mom, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because I learned in mental health first aid, this, and this. And I know you have a counselor. And if you don't call your counselor right now and have her call me back, I'm going to send the police to your house. That was somebody who works in retail, who was trained in mental health first aid and was able to pick up the signs of her mother and already lost a sibling by suicide. So again, get trained. The training is free. It doesn't cost anything. So it's available. This is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I would encourage everybody to take a picture of this. You'll get the slides. Keep this on your phone. You never know when you're going to use it. The other resource I have is the Trevor Project, which is specifically geared towards LGBTQ+ population. And they're a great resource. They have lots of things online. They have a talk line. So again, for people who need to access these kinds of resources, they're out there. So again, I've given you some resources. Guild Wars 2 is a gaming group that talks about being awkward and talks about some of these things while people are gaming. And that's not just kids, there's young adults on that as well. NAMI, which is the next resource, offers a ton of resources. The National Institute of Mental Health, ton of resources. Here's the two trainings I talked about, QPR and Youth Mental Health First Aid. And if you go on either of their websites, they can tell you where trainings are. And the Youth Mental Health First Aid is now virtual, so is QPR. So you can still get those trainings while you're sitting at home on this quarantine climate. So I'm gonna ask if there are any questions and answers. I apologize, I know we've gone over, but again, I think it's a really important topic. So I will field any questions that you have. Also, Kadi will put my information in the chat box. If there's a question you want to ask and you don't want to ask it publicly, I'll be happy to get back to you and answer those questions as well. So Kadi, I'm gonna.
Yes, hi, PJ. Thank you so much. We are having such a positive response, overwhelmingly positive, and that the suicide prevention conversation should definitely be normalized, and it has to, have a space for discussion within all assets, all areas, school and regular mental health settings, as well as any kind of community support. So at this time, I'm asking that all attendees, and again, thank you for staying with us. I know PJ went over, but if you have any resources you'd like to share, you can share it in the chat box with your colleagues, or if you have any specific questions for PJ, please feel free to send them in the Q&A pod, or I'm also keeping an eye on the chat box in case you have any specific questions as well. I see Maria Velez, thank you for staying with us, and Wendy as well. And I think there was a question about the trainings and QPR, mental health first aid. Can you discuss a little bit more about that? Because I had specific questions just on QPR.
Okay, so QPR is available online. If you go to that website, it will tell you where the trainings are available. It's a 2.5-hour training. and it is actually meets the school requirement for suicide training, their yearly requirement here in the New Jersey. I don't know other states have that. The youth mental health first aid was an 8-hour training. They have now, because they've done it virtually, have now decreased it to a 5-hour training. That is much more in depth. It goes into a lot more of the different mental health issues, what you might, signs and symptoms, what you might see. It goes a little bit more in depth in substance abuse, signs and symptoms. So the youth mental health first aid is a fairly in-depth course, whereas the QPR is the 2.5 hours, and it really just delves into, you know, how do you ask the question? There's scenarios where you practice answering the question and how you would approach somebody, so that you can practice some of those skills. Again, it just depends on what type of training you really want to have. Again, both of them are good trainings. One is 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and one is 5 hours. But again, with the youth mental health first aid, you're going to learn about the different diagnoses and the signs and symptoms and how suicide interplays with all of those. So.
Okay, thank you. So I also have a questions about the slides and webinar recordings. As I mentioned before, I will be sending out a follow-up email that contains a link to our survey. But within 1 or 2 days, the webinar recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be posted onto our website, and I will send a follow-up email with that information as well. So it will be sent to the email that you registered under and that you came onto the Zoom link, you know, registered under the Zoom link. So, you know, if you don't receive any communication from me regarding any of the survey links, I will enter in my email right now in the chat box. It's very simple, kati@shp.rutgers.edu. And then also I will type in PJ's email.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me. No question is invalid. So, you know, please feel free to reach out.
Oh, and then we have a question about people who have hearing incapacity, like hearing difficulties and deaf.
Mm-hmm.
If they can read the webinar, yes, they will be able to. The webinar recording is posted onto YouTube, and YouTube has a closed captioning feature, and that is what is going to enable the closed captioning. So just to answer your question. And then also the PowerPoint presentation has alternative text for people who are visually impaired as well. So if there's a screen reader, it will read the slides as well as describe the images contained in the slides with the alt text. So just to answer your question. And if you have any questions about any upcoming trainings, please feel free to reach out to us. We hope that you're also signed into our listserv, because that's how you stay up to date on any of our upcoming training events, including webinars, technical assistant programs, and virtual conferences. Normally, a lot of our trainings are either virtual or done in person, including our conferences, etc. So we're hoping that we can resume this sometime in the future. But for now, our virtual platform is the way we offer and deliver our training products. So as long as you're signed on to our listserv, we should be good. So PJ, we don't have any additional questions. Again, I'm sorry for the on and off. I think we had some technical difficulties with my internet, but now I'm able to stay on stably. So that's all for me. I hope you stay safe and well, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and stay safe and well.